You hear the scraping first, metal on stone. Then the screams. You're pressed so tight between armored bodies that you can't lift your arms. The man next to you is trying to say something, but his words are drowned by the thunder rolling down from above. Except it's not thunder. It's boulders. Massive, ancient stones tumbling from cliffs you can't even see through the fog. One lands 3 feet away, and you watch a warhorse collapse sideways, its rider still in the saddle, crushed into the mud without even a chance to draw his sword. You try to move backward, but there's nowhere to go. Behind you, 1,000 more knights are packed into this stone corridor, and ahead a wall of timber blocks the only way out. Above you, shadows move through the mist. They're not soldiers. They're not even armed properly. They're peasants with rocks and farming tools, and they're about to kill a king. This is the Battle of Posada, fought across 4 days in November 1330, and it should not have been possible. On one side, 30,000 men, representing the most advanced military technology of the medieval world. Heavy cavalry bred for impact. Plate armor forged in the finest workshops of Europe. Commanders trained since childhood in the art of war. On the other side, a collection of shepherds, farmers, and mountain villagers armed with whatever they could carry. No formation. No formal training. Just desperation and a leader who understood that geography could be a weapon sharper than any sword. The Hungarians came to conquer. The Wallachians came to survive. What happened in that mountain pass wasn't a battle. It was a slaughter. And the question that haunts every chronicle, every surviving letter, every mass grave discovered centuries later is this: how do you trap an army that believes it owns the world? Charles Robert of Anjou did not ask permission to rule Hungary. He took it, piece by piece, castle by castle, crushing the rebellious oligarchs who had turned his kingdom into a patchwork of rival fiefdoms. By the time he consolidated power in the early 1300s, Charles commanded one of the wealthiest states in Europe. The gold mines of Kremnica poured their treasure directly into his vaults. His currency was trusted from Paris to Constantinople. His knights rode destriers that cost more than a village, and they wore armor that could turn aside arrows like raindrops. Charles looked at the map and saw a kingdom that bent to his will. To the south, beyond the Carpathian Mountains, lay Wallachia, a wild frontier inhabited by Vlachs and Cumans, a place the Hungarians called Terra Transalpina, the land beyond the mountains. It was a buffer zone, a stretch of forest and river valleys that Charles considered his by right of proximity and power. But Wallachia had a ruler now. His name was Bessarab, and he was doing something unforgivable. He was acting like a sovereign. Before we walk further into this nightmare, I'd love to know where in the world you're watching from. It's extraordinary to me that a massacre hidden in the Carpathian Mountains 700 years ago can reach someone on the other side of the globe today. Bessarab I emerges from the historical fog with frustratingly few details. The chronicles written by his enemies describe him dismissively as a shepherd, a Cuman upstart, a man who should have been content to pay tribute and bow his head. But Bessarab was playing a far more dangerous game. He had united the scattered voivodeships between the Carpathians and the Danube into something resembling a state. He crossed the river and seized the fortress of Severin, a strategic gateway that controlled trade routes and military access into the Balkans. He stopped sending tribute to Buda. To Charles, this was not independence, it was theft. The king had spent his life bringing rebellious lords to heel, and Bessarab was just another little king who needed to be reminded of his place. The Hungarian court whispered encouragement. The campaign would be easy, they said. The Wallachians were primitives. A show of force, a quick march through the mountains, and Basarab would be dragged back to Buda in chains. Charles believed them. He gathered 30,000 men, the largest army Hungary had fielded in a generation, and marched south in the autumn of 1330. The first victory came without a fight. When the Hungarian host approached Severin, Basarab's garrison withdrew. The fortress gates opened. Charles established his court inside and waited for the inevitable surrender. And then it came. An envoy from Basarab arrived carrying an offer so generous it shocked even the Hungarian commanders. Basarab would renounce all claims to Severin. He would pay all back taxes. He would send one of his own sons to Buda as a hostage, and he would deliver 7,000 marks of silver, roughly 1.7 tons, enough to fund an army for months. It was a ransom for peace, paid by a man who wasn't supposed to be a king. Several of Charles's advisers urged him to accept. They had regained the territory. They would receive a fortune. They could return to Buda in triumph without losing a single man. Charles refused. He didn't just refuse. He mocked the offer. According to the chronicles, he told the envoys that Basarab was nothing more than a shepherd tending his sheep, and that he would drag the man by his beard from whatever hole he was hiding in. It was a declaration not of war, but of humiliation. Charles wanted submission. He wanted to see Basarab kneel. He ordered the army to continue south, deeper into Wallachia, toward the capital at Curtea de Arges. That's when the land began to fight back. The Hungarian columns marched into a green hell. Every well was poisoned or filled with rotting animal carcasses. Every granary stood empty. Basarab had stripped the countryside bare, moving his people and livestock into the mountains, leaving nothing behind but smoke. The scorched earth strategy was executed with surgical precision. Days turned into weeks. The immense supply train designed to carry loot back to Hungary became dead weight. 30,000 men began to starve. The chronicles do not shy away from the misery. Knights, men worth their weight in gold, were reduced to digging for roots in the forest floor. They slaughtered their war horses, the animals they had trained for years, just to survive another day. Some accounts suggest they boiled their leather saddles and chewed the softened hide. Disease followed the famine. Dysentery tore through the camps, weakening men already faint from hunger. And through it all, the Wallachians remained invisible. Occasionally, arrows would erupt from the tree line, striking a straggler or a scout. But by the time the Hungarian cavalry wheeled around to charge, the attackers had vanished into the mist. The great army was fighting a phantom. By the time they reached the vicinity of Curtea de Arges, Charles faced a humiliating reality. His army was dissolving not from combat, but from logistics. He had dragged his men into a wasteland, and now he had to get them out. With winter approaching and supplies gone, the king ordered a retreat. But he did not return the way he came. Seeking a faster route back to Transylvania, Charles turned his forces toward a mountain pass. He aimed for the defile. The king believed the danger was over. In his mind, the campaign was a failure but not a disaster. He was simply marching home to regroup. He did not know that Basarab had anticipated this exact route. The Wallachians were not retreating. They were racing ahead, climbing the ridges, piling stones, felling trees. Charles was not leading his men to safety. He was leading them into the kill zone. The exact location of the ambush remains one of history's great mysteries. The name Posada comes from a Slavic root meaning passage or defile, not a specific town on a map. Historians have debated the site for centuries, pointing to the Lishna Valley, the Mahadia region, the Bran Pass, but the geography is undeniable. Basarab chose a place where the mountains acted as a vice. As the retreating Hungarian column entered the gorge, the world began to shrink. The path narrowed to barely the width of a few horses riding abreast. On one side, a sheer drop into a ravine. On the other, steep forest-covered cliffs rising hundreds of feet into the gray sky. The heavy cavalry, the pride of Charles's army, became a liability. In the open field, a knight on horseback is a tank. In a narrow gorge, he is just traffic. The formation stretched out for miles, a thin, vulnerable snake of metal and flesh winding through the rocks. Communication became impossible. The vanguard could not see the rear guard. The king, riding somewhere in the middle, was blind to what lay ahead. High above, hidden by dense fir trees and mist, thousands of Wallachian peasants waited. They had spent days loosening massive boulders. They had piled trunks of fallen trees at the precipice. They had cut arrows, and they had built a wall. When the vanguard rounded a bend in the deepest part of the gorge, they stopped dead. A massive barricade of earth and timber blocked the path. Commanders shouted orders to clear it, but the structure was solid, packed tight with stone and logs. Confusion rippled down the line. Men shouted to move forward. Others shouted to go back. The column ground to a halt. Horses, sensing the anxiety of their riders, began to panic, jostling against one another. Knights were trapped in their saddles, unable to dismount in the crush, unable to turn, unable to lift their lances. 30,000 men frozen in a stone corridor. They looked up at the steep walls of the ravine and saw nothing but trees and fog. Then a signal echoed off the canyon walls. It might have been a horn. It might have been a shout. Or it might have been simply the sound of the first boulder tipping over the edge. The sky fell. From the high ridges, unseen hands levered massive stones over the cliff face. These boulders gathered speed as they careened down the steep slopes, smashing into the packed column below with the force of siege engines. Horses were crushed instantly. Knights encased in expensive plate and chainmail were flattened in their saddles. The armor that made them invincible on the plains became metal coffins. It could stop a sword, but it crumpled like foil under the weight of falling granite. Panic rippled through the gorge faster than the arrows. Horses, terrified by the thunderous noise and the smell of blood, began to thrash wildly, kicking and trampling their own riders. The narrow path turned into a meat grinder. Those who weren't crushed by rocks were trampled by their comrades. Then came the arrows. Wallachian archers positioned high above rained death down into the pit. They didn't need to aim. The Hungarians were packed so tightly that every arrow found a mark, a neck, a gap in the armor, the flank of a horse. The air filled with the sickening thud of bodkin points, piercing flesh, and the screams of wounded animals. Down in the defile, Hungarian commanders tried to rally their men. They shouted orders to form shield walls, to charge up the slopes, to do something. But orders were useless in the cacophony. The steep canyon walls were unclimbable for men in heavy gear. Those desperate enough to try clawing at the mud and roots were easily picked off by peasants above, or simply lost their footing and tumbled back into the crush. The slaughter continued relentlessly. The sun set, plunging the gorge into darkness, but the killing didn't stop. The Wallachians knew the terrain. They continued to harass the trapped army throughout the night. The Hungarians could not sleep. They could not light fires for fear of becoming targets. They stood in the mud, surrounded by the groans of the dying, waiting for the next rock to fall. By the second day, the ravine floor was paved with bodies. The surviving knights were exhausted, dehydrated, mentally broken. The distinct advantage of the flower of chivalry, their training, their discipline, their equipment, had been completely nullified. A peasant with a rock on a cliff was now superior to a duke with a sword in a ditch. By the third day, the concept of an army ceased to exist. The gorge had become a tomb. The survivors were no longer fighting for the glory of Anjou. They were clawing over the bodies of their friends just to breathe. The stench of 3 days of death, confined within narrow stone walls, was suffocating. Charles I, the man who had dreamed of uniting the East under his banner, now faced a stark reality. He was going to die here. The arrows were getting closer. The chants from the cliffs grew louder. The Wallachians were no longer content with dropping rocks. They were preparing to descend. In this moment of absolute terror, the king made a decision that would haunt his legacy. He summoned one of his most loyal commanders, Desiderius Hedivari, known in the chronicles as Desi. Charles stripped off his royal surcoat emblazoned with the lily of Anjou. He removed his gilded helmet. He ordered Desi to put them on. It was a cold calculation. Charles knew the Wallachians were hunting for the crown. By dressing Desi in the royal regalia, he created a decoy. Desi accepted the suicide mission. He rode out into the center of the kill zone, shouting commands, drawing every eye and every arrow to his position. The ruse worked with devastating efficiency. The Wallachian peasants, seeing the golden figure, swarmed. They abandoned their positions on the cliffs and poured down into the ravine like water. They carried scythes, clubs, knives. This wasn't a duel between knights. It was a mob execution. They pulled Desi from his horse. They did not ask for surrender. They hacked him to pieces, believing they were ending the war by killing the tyrant. While his friend was being butchered, Charles slipped away, clad in dirty leather, blending in with the terrified squires and foot soldiers. The King of Hungary scrambled toward the exit of the pass, accompanied by only a handful of guards. The hammer of the world fled like a thief in the night. Behind him, the massacre reached its zenith. With the king seemingly dead, the remaining Hungarian morale shattered. The Wallachians closed in for the kill. They moved among the trapped horses, slashing hamstrings. They pulled knights from their saddles and finished them on the ground. The casualty list read like a registry of the Hungarian state. The High Chancellor died. The Voivode of Transylvania was killed. Numerous bishops and high clergy, who had accompanied the crusade to bless the righteous slaughter, found that their prayers offered no protection against Wallachian steel. By the fourth day, silence finally returned to the gorge. The screaming stopped. The only sound left was the rushing water of the river, now running black with blood. Basarab had not just defeated an invading army, he had erased it. Charles escaped with his life, but he left his honor, his army, and the myth of his invincibility rotting in the mud of Posada. The return to Buda was a ghostly procession. Of the 30,000 men who had marched out with banners waving and armor shining, only a ragged few stumbled back across the border. They brought no gold, no hostages, no glory. They brought only the story of a massacre. Charles himself was a broken man. He had survived only by the grace of a disguise and the sacrifice of a friend. The psychological blow was immense. He had spent his entire reign constructing an image of absolute control, a monarch chosen by God to tame the unruly East. In the mud of Posada, that image shattered. The hammer of the world had struck the anvil of the Carpathians and cracked. For Hungary, the defeat was a catastrophe, but not a fatal one. The kingdom was wealthy and resilient. Charles would eventually rebuild his army. He would continue to rule for another decade, guiding Hungary to prosperity. But he never returned to Wallachia. The dream of incorporating the lands beyond the mountains into the Hungarian crown died in that pass. The border was drawn in blood, and it would remain fixed. For Basarab, the aftermath was transformative. He did not chase the fleeing Hungarians. He did not attempt to invade Transylvania. He understood the limits of his power. He had achieved his strategic objective, survival. By destroying the royal host, Basarab achieved de facto independence. He was no longer a vassal to be summoned or a shepherd to be mocked. He was the great voivode, a sovereign ruler who had defended his realm against a superpower. The victory at Posada legitimized his rule in the eyes of his people and grudgingly in the eyes of Europe. This moment marks the true genesis of Wallachia as a state. Before Posada, it was a collection of loose chieftains living under the shadow of foreign empires. After Posada, it was a country. Basarab is remembered not only as a warrior, but as Basarab Antamaya Togul, the founder. His victory at Posada in 1330 did more than humiliate a king. It severed a feudal chain. Though he and Charles of Hungary would later sign treaties under the looming threat of the Ottoman Empire, the balance had shifted. They spoke as rulers of distinct states. The Carpathians were no longer a gateway for conquest, but a warning. Posada was not a miracle. It was mathematics. Across medieval Europe, heavy cavalry was being undone by terrain and disciplined infantry. At Morgarten, and later at Agincourt, momentum was everything to a knight. Deny him distance, and you deny him power. In a narrow defile, armored cavalry became trapped weight. Basarab invested nothing but geography. Rocks, timber, gravity, free weapons against a fortune in steel and bloodstock. Charles, blinded by pride and sunk costs, marched deeper into a landscape he neither understood nor respected. Basarab did not just win a battle. He secured survival and rewrote the logic of power in Eastern Europe.